This week on QDL, we talk to Stanley Chao, Managing Director of All In Consulting and author of Selling to China, a guide for small and medium-sized businesses. And we're going to be talking to Stanley about counterfeit personal protective equipment that we see coming onto the market. Find out more when we come back. Welcome back to QDL. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making news in the world of quality. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief of Quality Digest. And today, we're going to talk about a huge problem that agencies and healthcare institutions and other large institutions around the world are facing, and that is counterfeit personal protective equipment, or PPE. As current stocks of PPE were quickly depleted at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, agencies and institutions around the world started scrambling to find new sources because the PPE was running out very quickly. And not surprisingly, new sources magically appeared. Unfortunately, many of them were selling fake PPE. This came largely in two forms from what we can tell. The first were your classic knockoffs. Distributors were selling what looked like legit PPE coming from approved PPE vendors, all the way down to forged packaging and paperwork, so that people might have thought they were actually receiving PPE from whoever, and the paperwork and the packaging all looked legit, except when you open it up, looked at what was in it, let's say a N95 mask, it turned out that it was a fake N95 mask. Other fakes came from companies that almost overnight retooled their manufacturing facilities to make and distribute PPE and claim to have the appropriate testing and approval documentation. In this case, they were manufacturing PPE, but the documents themselves were fake, and of course the PPE itself was also not meeting the standards that should be required for that kind of personal protection equipment. Okay, today we are welcoming back a guest we have had on the show a few times, Stanley Chao, Managing Director of All In Consulting and author of Selling to China, a guide for small and medium-sized businesses. Hi Stanley, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you again for having me, Dirk.
Hey, no problem. First, before we get started here, full disclosure, your company, All In Consulting, you consult with companies looking to meet up with manufacturers and distributors in China. You are currently working with companies in the United States that are looking for PPE, is that right?
That's correct. We are receiving consulting fees, and we are helping American companies purchase PPE from China. That's
okay.
correct.
So, how big a problem is fake PPE from your experience, what you've been seeing over the last, 5-6 months or so?
Yeah, before 6 months ago, fake PPEs was never really a problem because the margins were too low. We started getting a scent of fake PPEs around March. When the U.S. started going into shelters, the Chinese government were actually telling Chinese companies to make PPEs. So you had auto manufacturers, textile companies, computer companies started making N95 masks, and they all saw this big rush, big demand from the U.S. And that's when we started hearing about all these fake PPEs coming in.
And have you experienced any of this yourself? I know you work with a lot of Chinese manufacturers and Chinese distributors. Were you approached by companies that were looking to sell something that you thought was shady?
Yes, and we've all gotten these emails already where some company asking you to, if you want to purchase masks or PPEs. I started getting phone calls from American businesses that wanted to sell PPE. They then would connect me with their Chinese contact And as I'm talking to them, I'm realizing they're either not associated with a factory, and if they are associated with a factory, they are not making PPEs up to standards. They would often show me the FDA certs or the health ministry, Chinese health ministry documents, and it didn't look right. A lot of the English in the FDA documents weren't proper English,
Right.
and so those are all tall tale signs of a fake company.
So these were American distributors who had set up an agreement with some manufacturer in China, is what you're saying.
Yes,
Okay.
and not just distributors. I'm having individuals call me,
Oh, wow.
store owners, a auto parts store owner. Everybody and their brother thinks now they can make a killing selling PPEs. So I get the call saying, I know a friend of a friend in China who knows some factory, or I know some distributor in Hong Kong that can get me 5 million masks. And they all say it's going to be easy. And I tell them, no, it's not going to be easy.
Right.
Doing business in China is very difficult, and you will be taken to the cleaners.
So do you think so? So it sounds like what you're saying is that the U.S. distributor or person that calls you may not know that they're getting fake PPE. They just know that, oh yeah, there's this guy who has N95 masks and all N95 masks are the same. Or do you think they kind of understand that what they're getting may not be legit?
I think most people that I'm talking to think they are getting the proper PPEs. They're getting standardized. The the thought of even getting something fake isn't even entering the minds of these companies and people. They just see a very easy way to profit, and they think they're the only ones that have this particular contact
Right.
in China. And it really comes from um, not having experience doing business in China. Yeah.
Oh. Now, you mentioned right at the beginning that the Chinese government was encouraging companies to manufacture PPE. Now, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they meant to do it legitimately or not.
Um, Chinese, okay, they were still right in the middle of the coronavirus.
Sure.
So the Chinese themselves were having a shortage of PPEs. So they were encouraging Chinese companies to manufacture PPEs. And then they would have whatever local health officials go to certify these factories.
Okay.
But these factories they were uprooting faster than the officials could go in to certify the companies.
Okay.
And soon they just flooded the markets. And then the export business and it continues to go crazy. So the government simply didn't have the time to go and inspect and certify. And the demand was just too great. So
Okay.
it just happened overnight. Yeah.
All right. Now, so you have written an op-ed for us that'll be published be coming out shortly.
Mm-hmm.
And you make an interesting premise for the op-ed is that although there are obviously Chinese counterfeiters who are deliberately, counterfeiting, knocking off PPE or are forging documents to look like they have proper approvals and so forth, you're not laying all the blame on the Chinese. Your op-ed said that there's plenty of blame going around, including purchasers in the United States. So why don't you explain that a little bit?
Sure, sure. Um, of course, you have to put about 50% of the blame on the Chinese. They're making counterfeits, they're putting wrong brands on it. But there are individuals in America, there are hospitals, uh, states, governments that have never done business in China. And they think you can get what you want by simply making a couple phone calls, uh, agreeing on a price, and then wiring money over, and then that product is going to come over in a week. Um, I've been doing business in China for over 30 years, and it's not that easy. On top of that, most of these agencies, these people that are buying, they don't even know the product. They don't know what a proper N95 mask looks and feels like. If you're going into a deal, especially China, ignorant of the price, ignorant of the supply, ignorant of the product, you're asking yourselves to get burned. On top of that, you have a large group of people that are just trying to make a buck. They are trying to profiteer.
Right.
They're buying it for $4 and they know they can sell it on the street for $10.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any sympathy for these people.
Right.
They are getting burned, and they should get burned.
Now, what and does this extend to the end user that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So they go to a distributor. Hey, I got a 10 million PPE you can buy. I got 10 million N95 masks or KN95 masks you can buy. And yeah, I'm paying a little bit more than I want, but boy, you got them. They get them in. Do they even recognize? Do you think that what they've gotten is fake? We mentioned, it's in the news quite a bit, an N95 mask should not have ear loops. It should have a headband. Do you think people even know that when they get them, or they just accept them?
They don't even know it. They don't even know what it should look like, how it should feel. You talked about the ear loops. That is the biggest signal that something is fake. All N95 masks have to have a headband. And the most labor intensive part of that headband is attaching it onto the mask, whether you have to stitch it, sew it, whereas these ear loops, they're simply being glued onto it. And that tells you what the Chinese are thinking. They know that they're dealing with ignorant buyers that don't know the product, to the point that the Chinese don't even need to make perfect counterfeits. As long as it looks 80% good or 70% good, it's going to sell.
Yeah.
And you can't do that when you're doing business with China.
Okay. So, for short of someone calling in a company like All In Consulting, some people are doing that, obviously. But short of doing that, what are just some simple measures people can take to keep from getting scammed? And not just in the COVID-19, not just in case of like say masks right now, but just in general. What can people do to prevent that from happening in the future?
Sure. The most important thing, and we just talked about that, is you have to know the product. You have to know what it looks like, what it feels like, the weight of it, the type of materials that it's made from. You pick it up and you can get a pretty good feeling whether it's real or fake. Secondly, you don't want to be more than 3 layers away from the source, from the manufacturer. With these PPEs, we're helping some companies trace all the way back to the manufacturer, and we're seeing 7 to 10 layers between who they're buying from and the actual source. By the time you get to 4 or 5 layers, you don't know where the product is coming from. You don't know whether the documentation is correct, and you don't know how many times that product has changed hands. And third, you want to have a contact at the factory, someone that you can confirm an order, get schedules. If there's quality problems, you can call. And lastly, it's hard to do, but you want to visit the factory. If you're putting in large orders, at some point you want to go there, you want to see the processes, and you want to get to know the people there.
Okay. So changing gears a little bit, there's a topic you mentioned to me in when we were emailing that I think sounds interesting, and maybe we'll explore it deeper later, but I at least wanted to touch on it right now. You're saying you're making some prognostications for the future, and you think that we're heading toward what you call a manufacture local to sell local world economy. And why don't you explain what you mean by that?
Sure, sure. The with the trade war happening the last 2 years, China-U.S. relations already wasn't very good. President Trump was already talking about bringing back supply chains. This coronavirus has just made matters worse to the point where U.S.-China relations are at the lowest point that I have ever seen. The majority of Americans blame the Chinese for the virus. The rhetoric coming from President Trump about raising tariffs, about bringing back supply chains. The United States now, not just the government, but the people are very anti-China, to the point where I don't think Americans want to buy made in China. And so companies, they're not going to leave China, but they're not going to export from China back to the U.S. So they're going to have to bring some supply chains back either to the U.S. or U.S. friendly countries to manufacture. Made in U.S., made in Mexico, made in Canada is going to sound a lot better from a PR standpoint than made in China. Likewise, this Chinese now have a lot of anti-U.S. feelings, and the Chinese and U.S. companies can't simply export to China from the U.S. American companies will have to manufacture locally in China to sell to China. So we're heading towards a bifurcated world where you're going to have to make things in a U.S. friendly country to sell to the U.S., and you're going to have to make things in China or a China friendly country to sell to China.
So what you're saying is that we may not buy something made in China, but we'll buy something made by a Chinese company in the United States.
Yes,
Okay.
because you won't be able to tell the difference, right? You'll go to Home Depot and you'll see a made in USA hammer for $15 and a made in China hammer for $8. People may now buy that $15 hammer, but not knowing that that's really a Chinese company in America. Yeah.
Right, and I believe there was not mainland China, but a Taiwanese company just made I think a chip manufacturer, wasn't it? Just landed a big contract to manufacture in Arizona or something?
Arizona, Taiwan Semiconductor just announced a $12 million factory to be built.
12 million or 12 billion?
$12 billion.
Billion dollar, okay.
To make chips in America. And this, I think, follows in line with my prediction of what is coming. Yeah, you won't be able to produce in China and bring it over to the U.S.
Okay. And do you think United States companies will be able to do this same thing? Will a United States, I don't know, textile manufacturer be able to set up shop in China and sell to the Chinese?
I think they will. The Chinese seem to be, the Chinese like American brands. That's when you go to Shanghai, Beijing, all you see is American brands on the street. But I think if you can put a made in China label on an American brand, that's going to be much more sellable.
Sure. Probably for the same reasons that Made in USA works in the United States as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. People like to buy from their local, like to buy from the country, buy locally, as you said.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Stanley Chao, Managing Director of All In Consulting and author of Selling to China, a guide for small and medium-sized business. Thanks for joining us today. It's always interesting to talk to you, see what's going on in China and China business.
Thank you for having me, Dirk.
Hey, no problem. There is a link to Stanley's book underneath the player page down there. So be able to check out his book on Amazon. There's links to the other articles that we mentioned here as well. That is our show for today. And as usual, if there is someone or something you'd like us to bring on the show, let us know. Just send us an email to qdl@qualitydigest.com, and we'll do our best to cover them. Thanks for joining us today, and we will see you at the next QDL. So long.